Hello, everyone, and welcome to CERRE's webinar on navigating European rules on prominence of general interest content. We have an excellent panel here today. We first have the author of our report on rules on prominence, Michèle Leger, will be presenting the findings from her report. Followed by that, we'll have responses from our distinguished speakers. First, we have Anna Herold, who is the head of the unit on audiovisual and media services at DG CNECT at the European Commission. And then we will be hearing from Bertrand. I'm sorry, I'm going to make my best attempt at the names. Who is coming to us from France Télévisions, where he is head of audiovisual and digital law unit there. We'll have Carolina Lorenzon, who is the international affairs director at Media for Europe, followed by a voice from the United Kingdom. Jonathan Mackay will be joining us. He is the project director in the broadcast media group at UK's regulator Ofcom. So thank you very much for joining us today. We will be able to take questions from the audience during the Q&A section or in the chat. I will now hand it over to Michèle.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sally, for that introduction. And yeah, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today to present to you this issue paper that I wrote basically over the last summer on this fundamental question of how to ensure the prominence of media content on online platforms and digital services. So I'll just, I haven't got long to present the paper to you. It's quite a detailed issue paper in the end. It was only meant to be about 10 pages long. It got a bit out of hand because this topic is so interesting. And so maybe I'll just move towards the slides now. So yeah, it's really one of the most fundamental questions, I think, at the moment, and it's to do with how to make sure that all the great content that we have, media content, but also other types of content, maybe, so linear TV, on-demand services, etc., is basically reaches the audiences and is prominently displayed on all the various platforms that we have now, where in fact many of the young audiences are present, and because of course the method of consumption of the media services has changed so much. So how can we make sure that that content is made visible to them and is prominently displayed? So what I've done is I've basically looked, I took a number of I started off with a Council of Europe guidance note, which was written a couple of years ago on the prioritization of public interest content online. And so I looked at that as a sort of general overarching framework, if you want. And I think that now we've got that, it would be quite nice if everybody at least read it and make sure to respect the rules that are included in that. And then what I did is I looked at all the EU level rules that we have on prominence. Of course, we've got the rules of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which I'm going to talk mainly about, of course. And then we've also got rules in the European Media Freedom Act on the customization of media offers. And then we've got rules on the DSA on recommender systems. We've got rules on the DMA. We've got the Code of Practice on Online Disinformation, and we've also got must-carry rules in the Electronic Communications Code. So what I did was I looked at all that, and basically from all that, it inspired me to come up with issues and make recommendations, primarily, I suppose, on how Article 7A could be moved forward. And then now let me see what else I wanted to tell you. Then I also looked at the implementation of Article 7A, because of course all these news are incredibly new, and oops, it's gone too quickly now. And so can we just move forward? So I looked at the implementation of Article 7 in the main member states where we've got rules, which is basically France, Germany, and Italy at member state level. And I also looked at the online safety, the media bill in the UK, which was proposed last year. Now, of course, there are more countries that are developing rules at the moment, and there are about 10 member states that will probably be moving towards rules on prominence. So it's not something that's there to stop. There's going to be more rules, and I think that's why it's so important that we should look at all that now. Now let me just move forward again. This is where you can access the report. So it's basically an issue paper and was finished at the end of round about November of last year. So there are things that have moved since. So let me just go now dive in to the substance of the report. So I think looking at Article 7A, it's it's got laudable ambitions, but I think it has got some missing links, and the missing links are complicated to fill in a way, because there is this articulation between what should be covered by EU level harmonization versus what is the power and what should remain the competence of the EU member states. So that's always the very difficult balance to achieve in all this. Now, I think probably Article 7A, as it stands, because it is so short, probably should perhaps feature more EU level harmonization in certain areas. Now, I'm not saying that everything that I'm going to talk about on this slide should be necessarily completely harmonized at EU level, but at least we could be looking at it. So the first question is, what are services of general interest? And the big problem is that I'm seeing that at national level, of course, we have got very different approaches in what they are, with some countries like Germany going, having a big list of different types of services that should be considered as general interest services, whereas others have a more narrow list. Maybe that's within the competence of the member states, but just to tell you that's the situation, and there could perhaps be more flesh on the EU level rules to try and settle, how the process should be determined of what something is of general interest. Then the big thing is, are the services present on the platform to start with? So here it's the articulation, if you want, between the rules on must carry and the rules on prominence, because there's no point in having rules on prominence if you don't have rules on if they're not present at the start on the platform. And maybe you could introduce rules on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory access. That's a possibility, drawing on what you have in the DMA. So that's a question. And I've also looked a lot at the must carry provisions, because we've had them in the EU legislation for quite a while now, plus they've been revised, so they've been detailed quite a lot. So I think we can seek inspiration as well from that. The other question is, and I can't see what there is on that, on how should prominence be ensured? Because of course that's also a matter of we see different methods at national level, but I also think that there should be probably a big role to be played by the platforms themselves, because they should probably be in the driving seat as well, because it is their services. So there should perhaps be some mention in the EU legislative framework which would reflect the Council of Europe guidance note that the platforms should have their word to say on that. On what platforms? That's a big area of legal uncertainty as well. And at national level, again, you see many different approaches. Some of them talk about platforms that have got a special threshold of use, like a number of items that have been sold if we're talking about connected TVs. In other countries, you don't have that notion. And looking at the must carry rules, I think, having some sort of an idea of a platform that's being used by a significant number of end users to view content would be quite a good thing, leaving up to member states then to decide. And then the payment question's not settled either. Should, despite prominence rules, should there be payment? Rules for procedure are not embedded either. How should you settle disputes? Should you have a role for regulators there? Transparency, should users be informed of the fact that if there are prominence rules, why there is prominence rules? and then the review process, because we might have all these rules in place at national level, but then maybe, you know, it would be good to be able to review it all and to see how it's functioning in practice. So those are some of the recommendations that I make, but then there are a few more macro points. One of them is we are focusing at the moment on audiovisual services, linear and non-linear in Article 7A. Now, what about disaggregated content? You know, individual items of news, individual documentaries, etc. We don't have anything there. Should that be covered? I'm not saying it should necessarily, but I'm just saying that in a forward-looking scenario, probably we will need to cover that, bearing in mind that we do need to respect the editorial integrity of the channels and of the services. Radio is covered in all the implementing acts, but it's not covered at EU level. The press is left out, and here I'm looking at EMFA, which has got a much broader scope of application than the AVMSD. So, you know, is all that sustainable? Then the articulation between rules on prominence and the ability to customize media offers, and that's another area of where it's pretty complicated to work out how all this will pan out. And I'll just move quickly on now to the last bit, and we can discuss all this more, of course, in the question and answer sessions. The inherent internal market problem that we are seeing with these rules. All three sets of draft legislation have been submitted to the European Commission under the regulatory transparency procedure to see if they are compatible with the internal market principle. And the Commission has noted in all cases that national rules on prominence that would be imposed on information society services, so things like Alexa, things like the App Store that are established in other member states are contrary to the country of origin principle. So the big question is, you know, how are member states taking a risk when they are adopting such legislation, and how could that be settled? Bearing in mind, of course, that if there is an inherent internal market problem, the whole prominence rules can be sort of forgotten about, because of course there's no point in putting prominence rules just on the on the traditional television platforms that we've all been used to, because that's not where the young people are. So, you know, that's the main problem I see. Anyway, that's it now. I hope I haven't gone vastly over time. I really look forward to all your comments, because it's a fascinating area that keeps on moving. And the more you think about it, the more there is.
Okay, thank you very much, Michèle. First, we'll go to Anna Herold, who was very much behind the scenes of the whole AVMSD process and the inclusion of Article 7A. Anna.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Michèle, for this very timely analysis. It took us time, you know, to start discussing it, but I think it comes also at a very topical moment, no? Because with EMFA basically about to being adopted in a few weeks' time, and then entering into force soon, of course, this discussion could not be more timely. So I will start, despite what Sally has mentioned, obviously with EMFA, because if you want, we very much see the rules that now are included in what has become Article 20 of the Media Freedom Act, the famous rules on right to customization that Michèle obviously has included in her analysis. This provision have been a little bit, you know, the European response, if you want, to all the issues that you know, we have started discovering with the proliferation of the national prominence regime. And if you want, they, in a very different manner, because of course we are taking a very much user perspective, they still pursue, we would argue, the same objective, which is to make sure, you know, which is to address this fundamental issue that Michèle mentioned at the beginning. How can we make sure that users continue to have access to a wide range of culturally, socially, and locally relevant content. And of course, these two do not coincide entirely, because obviously in the approach of EMFA, which is very much user-oriented, we do not take any value judgment on the type of content that users would like to have more prominent on its own interface or through his or her own device. But the objective ultimately is the same, that we all are exposed to a wider range of programming. So that has been a little bit the underlying logic. And if you want, it is also a little bit, you know, the new frontier of media regulation, because in order to regulate pluralism in this new environment that, you know, that has become already disintermediated, you know, through the arrival of course of social media and platforms, you know, for a very long time, but, you know, continues to be in flux because of the new ways people access content and new ways in which content is actually finds actually its way to the users. This sort of, you know, basic media pluralism question has become very much central, you know, to any sensible media regulation. So now, how do we make sense of this two-sided framework now? No, so on the one hand, having this obligation in EMFA for user interface. For user interfaces for devices to allow users to customize their home screens as they wish, and at the same time, of course, the continued possibility for member states, of course, within certain limits, within single market limits, under Article 7A of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, to enact this general interest prominence obligations. We think that they could coexist. We're not saying that there are no tensions, and one was very vocally presented by Michèle, you know, the basic single market premise, you know, that of course we have to make it work in a market where most of the providers of these user interfaces, of course, are cross-border players. So we would like to make it work for those players as well. There are also exceptions, as you know, for precisely for media pluralism reasons. So, you know, there might be a way ultimately. But I think, again, these two do not necessarily exclude each other. So just to give you maybe one first answer, you know, to another question that I think Michèle alluded to, although she went very quickly through it. Do the new rules in EMFA, how do they interact with the national prominence regimes? No, can they coexist? So I think we would take an interpretation here precisely because of what I said, you know, that both pursue the same objective, which is ultimately access to a wider media diversity, that tries, you know, to see their harmonious application. Of course, everything will be in the detail and practice, and I do not pretend to be, you know, the biggest expert on this technical ways how the interfaces are being designed, but we think that you could easily, of course, allow at the same time the user to change its interface, you know, and probably also move around, obviously move around those icons that give access to the general interest services that were designed at the national level. But I think we should not take an interpretation that would go as far as to say, you know, that they should prevail totally over the user choice, but neither interpretation that would mean that you could remove entirely, you know, those services from the interface. So I think that an addressee of both obligations could be it could he or she could be it could be, you know, perfectly possible for a provider to still continue to give prominence to a certain service on the interface without disturbing the basic choice of the customer that might have, you know, in its preferences in the first row of its content choices, decided not to have any of the services that were designed as general interest. So it is tricky, but I think that there could be a way, and of course we are very keen to discuss this now with the addressees of these obligations, you know, at EU level through a regulation, no, that of course has a certain legal value that normally prevails over national rules. And of course, also those that in certain markets that you have analyzed have now also the general interest obligations that are allowed by the directive. And maybe one last issue, of course, we are observing this market very carefully and observing what member states, you know, are enacting that area. You have mentioned our reactions under the Transparency Directive. And there is also a possibility for us, and we will certainly take active use of this possibility to provide some guidelines. And I think this was also something that that you have been recommending, to try to make sense, you know, in this chaos of possible new national obligations. For now, we have, you know, a few regimes at member state level, but there is, you know, a keen interest, of course, to this issue. So we will certainly be looking at trying to make, you know, some sense, not the least also for the addressees of the obligations, no, that of course in the end will have to comply. And in that spirit, we're thinking very much of front loading this part of EMFA, you know, in our implementation strategy, and possibly organize a stakeholder dialogue to discuss these issues, you know, probably as soon as the new commission, you know, it comes into office. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. So delicate balance is to be made between the interests of presenting people with diverse information and also enabling user choice and user autonomy. Now, let's hear from Bertrand Scirpo, who comes from a service of general interest in a country where we have these rules. Bertrand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Indeed, Article 7A is of utmost importance for broadcasters and especially for public service media. And France Télévisions and the European Broadcasting Union, that regroup all the public audiovisual media in Europe, have from the start strongly and actively supported its adoption. So I was asked to present the situation in France. So I will go straight to the legal and regulatory framework in a very summarized way, of course, in those few minutes. But I might can answer other questions later on. In France, so it's only since the beginning of last month that the Audiovisual, which is our national regulatory authority, published the last two texts which were missing to complete the legal and the regulatory framework. So the French audiovisual law, Article 20 to be precise, requires providers of user interfaces that exceed certain thresholds to give appropriate visibility to services of general interest in their entirety or in part, and in accordance with provisions laid down by the Audiovisual. So 3 points: what is a user interface, and what is a service of general interest, and what is appropriate visibility? So a user interface, according to the law, is any system presenting a choice among several media services or programs which is installed on a TV set or on a connected speaker, and that is made available, by a service aggregator or an app store. So we have different devices, and only the providers of these user interfaces that go beyond certain thresholds defined by decree will have to comply with the national rules. So those thresholds are 150,000 user interfaces for those that are part of a subscription or rented user interfaces on TV sets, connected devices, or voice assistant, for instance, and 3 million unique visitors per month on the French territory for the user interfaces that are the ISP's boxes or service aggregators delivered by OTT or application stores. So approximately 30 user interfaces have been identified by the Audiovisual that exceed those thresholds, and they will have to comply with those new rules. For instance, Samsung TVs equipped with a Tizen OS, Amazon Alexa, Apple TV Plus, Sony PlayStation 5, Amazon Prime, Apple Store, or some 2 universal remote controls, one for all and Melicani. So that's just few examples of those user interfaces. Now, second question, who will benefit from the appropriate visibility? First of all, the public media companies. They are granted appropriate visibility by law for the accomplishment of their public service remit. The law gives also the possibility for the Audiovisual to qualify as a SGI, service of general interest, some commercial services, but only after public consultation and in a proportionate manner and with regard to their contribution to pluralism and cultural diversity. Last February, the Audiovisual adopted a draft deliberation that provides that all national free-to-air DTT channels and their free non-linear services will qualify as services of general interest. And the Audiovisual considered that those services and their associated non-linear services were those that best meet the requirements of the law, which is to be a certain proportionate number. So there are 25 DTT channels in France, including the public services. And their contribution to pluralism and cultural diversity is ensured by the authorization mechanism of the services. So this list has been long awaited, and we are very pleased of its publication, and probably the Audiovisual faced difficult selection exercise. But with 25 services qualified as services of general interest plus radio, the question arises of how this visibility will be ensured between those services. Because as you know, as on user interfaces, what I call the advantageous display areas are very limited. For instance, on the first page of the home page, there are only 4 or 5 services or program thumbnails that can be highlighted on the first row, on the first page, without having to scroll down. So these are the very advantageous display areas. So services of general interest, 25 of them in a very limited zone among other services that are not services of general interest. So it will be a challenge. Now, third and last question, what is appropriate visibility according to the Audiovisual? So last February, the Audiovisual specified the conditions in a deliberation that came and complete the law that specifies that appropriate visibility can in particular be ensured by giving prominence on home pages, recommendations of programs, in the results of searches, or on remote control devices. That's the law. And the Audiovisual specified the conditions. So first of all, SGI, services of general interest, shall be easily accessible. That's the principle. On home pages, operations to get access to services of general interest shall not be more burdensome by their nature or number of action than those to get access to services that are not of general interest. On remote controls, those remote controls that propose direct access to certain services must also propose a direct access to services of general interest. Thirdly, on results of searches, services of general interest and their programs shall be treated in a fair and non-discriminatory manner. So those principles are very useful, but still, I think we have to wait and to see how they will be implemented, because might be very difficult, but I still think we are very pleased of those principles which are strong and that hopefully will help broadcasters and especially public service media to comply with their public service mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertrand. I'm imagining a French remote control with 25 buttons directly accessing. No, I'm joking. But it sounds like within these general interest content things, there might be need some ideas about actual priorities within those lists when we talk about the mechanization. And I'm intrigued by the fact that the law refers to service in its entirety or it's in part, and we haven't had a chance to discuss a little bit this issue of disaggregation or not disaggregation. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Carolina, whose company operates services of general interest, arguably across multiple jurisdictions. Carolina.
Thank you, Sally. Hello, everybody. I'm not, as we operate in multiple jurisdictions, I'm not going to concentrate on the Italian law, and namely the deliberation by Agcom, which is actually just to set the scene. It was adopted last December, and there is now, as of February, there's a technical table that has been set up, and I think they already met twice for the implementation of what is called Annex A, which is about the availability of the LCN, the logical channel numbering on remote controls, and the availability of a common icon. And perhaps this is a different approach from the French approach, a common icon on all devices to identify linear channels. The other part will be Annex B on online delivery, namely non-linear. But first of all, there's no time, and it has not been notified, the final version, to the Commission, so I can't really talk about it. But you've asked me sort of to gauge how the interplay between the different provisions of the EU acquis can play out in order to ensure that there, I would say, 4 key issues for us. Of course, discoverability, huge question of access, and ensure that our brands and the bargaining power will remain in the online environment as well. We've built, just like the EU has an acquis, we have an acquis of what we've been able to build in a dual system, because in Italy also commercial broadcasters, and I think it's the same in Germany too, provide general interest services, which are defined on the basis of universal service penetration. For example, again in Italy, Mediaset, which belongs to MFE, in a total audience environment accounts for 80%. So, you know, the services that have to be available have to be free, carry news, and have a meaningful penetration. So on this, I should say that we very much welcome the EMFA interplay between Article 7A and Article 16 on the possibility for the media board to work with the Commission to provide guidelines. And in our view, whilst as Michèle explained, it is a prerogative of the member states to define pluralism, to define public service broadcasting. So there is a perfect balance between what is up to the member states and what and the freedom of users. But I doubt that we will be able to reach a common definition of general interest services. And I think that member states will resent that. If you look at the list of the LCN list of the general interest services in Germany, it's over 300. And you have anything from fast channels. And so in our view, that should be the prerogative of the member states, with the sort of arbitrage of the positive exchange within the media board. I think that process that the Commission could lead in steering guidelines should also help perhaps to clarify the doubts that, Italy, France, and Germany exercise, as Michèle said, their prerogatives to define what general interest services are and to which platforms and interfaces should be applied. But then there was this problem of consistency with the e-commerce directive. In my view, this reminds me of what happened with the limitation of liability in the e-commerce directive and the copyright directive. So there is a need, whilst we work on the acquis. But what I like about the European regime is that it is dynamic. And in this context of where technology goes much faster, it is important that the role of the ENFA Media Board will be very significant in this sense. And on the Michèle briefly touched upon also the Council of Europe itemized prominence by content, and I fear that is a dangerous route we shouldn't take. First of all, it's not consistent with Article 7b, which provides for the protection of cynical integrity, but it also will strengthen the market power of platforms which should actually be regulated under the DMA. So I don't have much time, but my point is that we can come up with the best possible prominence rules, but unless the question of access is clarified under the DMA, we will never reach what Europe is trying to get, because what Europe is trying to implement. I don't agree when with this vulgata saying that the problem of scarcity is no longer affecting the delivery of audiovisual media services online, because actually access to online delivery is controlled by a handful of global players. So to make a long story short, the designation of connected TVs as gatekeeping CPS within the DMA, and also I should say virtual voice assistants, because also virtual assistants can be a shortcut to retrieve content online, that will enable prominence rules to play out fairly. So I can't really talk about contestability, but at least make sure that we will not disappear, because when an online gatekeeper controls both the OS, the search engine, and the more CPSs it controls with proprietary systems, then they control access at the wholesale level, and on the retail level, they compete with audiovisual media service providers for advertising viewing time. So it's the same old story, but this time, I think as have been, for example, digital terrestrial broadcasters in the past, we have been curtailed in our capacity to get more spectrum. In the same way now, delivery online, the network for delivery, and the interfaces, which are a crucial gateway to access consumers, should come under the lens of the Commission in the DMA implementation. Else, our brands will disappear, and along with it, our bargaining power, because it's not enough to be prominent if then gatekeeping platforms will take a cut, will take a toll on us, on both on our revenues, on our data, and on top of it, those platforms with the OS on a single sign-on, they can put together so many data that they can, there is no way the contestability can be ensured fairly if we don't have access to the same level of data. And by the way, under the DMA, we can only have access to the data generated by our own services. Then it is to be determined how and in which format. But the gatekeeping OS, especially when combined with search, can see what everybody else has been delivering. So this is an issue of competition, and I'm saying again that unfortunately prominence rules may not be enough, or better, they will play out fairly if we have certain services like connected TVs and voice assistants designated under the DMA. This is the point I wanted to make.
Thank you, Carolina. We saw in the French case that Bertrand was talking about that the voice assistant and the connected TVs were included in their prominence rules. So definitely, an interesting space. We're going to move now to the UK. Jonathan is going to bring us a little bit across the water. The UK does have a bill in process that does include prominence rules. So, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sally.
And I'll just remind everyone, after Jonathan, we're opening up to kind of more discussion and questions. So please feel free to go ahead and put questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom, because we'll be able to take some of those questions as we have our discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you, CERRE, for giving me Ofcom the opportunity to take part in this timely and really important panel discussion. Fascinating as well. I only have a few minutes, and I don't want to hold up the question and answer session. So rather than getting into too much technical detail of the UK's sort of new media bill regime, I thought useful to highlight some hopeful, useful points of comparison between the UK's approach and what colleagues have set out and at the national levels and at the EU level, and also mindful of Michèle's point she highlighted in her slides. But for anyone else who wants to know more, on our Ofcom's website, we have recently published a document, a roadmap on our plans for putting all parts of the media bill into practice once it becomes law. Very quickly on the background, the media bill in the UK is the first major update of our legislation in this area for some 20 years. So not before time, really, given the seismic changes in how people watch and listen to content, audio and audiovisual. And it will modernise the regulatory framework for the UK's public service broadcasters, so the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, STV in Scotland and S4C in Wales, giving more flexibility in how those broadcasters deliver their obligations online and on linear TV. It'll also introduce new duties for a wider range of tech companies. But one important caveat, just to express that the media bill is not yet law. It's still going through its journey in the UK Parliament, but with a fair wind, hopefully we'll get royal assent sometime in May or June. Cross fingers, not guaranteed. A core part of that bill will, of course, be the introduction of new rules to ensure that this is specific to the UK public service broadcasters, to ensure that their on-demand and streaming services are made available and are made prominent on the most popular connected TV platforms that operate in the UK. This is still to be set out in the secondary legislation, but it's likely to include smart TVs, set-top boxes, the peripheral devices, smart sticks, pucks, And the new obligations will apply to what the bill calls the television selection service. So in simple terms, the company who controls the operation of the TV user interface, the operating software. The new rules are not exactly brand new in the UK. They build on our existing regime for broadcast TV distribution that guarantees public service channels get prominence and are widely available on terrestrial channels. And similar to that regime, as Michèle was mentioning, the new rules will require that the public service broadcasters offer their on-demand services like BBC iPlayer, ITVX to the connected TV platforms that fall in scope. And these platforms will be required to must carry the PSB service and make them appropriately prominent on their user interface. I think it's important to stress as a point of comparison, given what fellow panelists have said and this use papers highlight, and developments in connected TV interfaces and how audiences are increasingly accessing and discovering content. It isn't just the PSB service that should be made prominent on the UI. It's the content that the broadcasters use to deliver their PSB remits, that range of content, and the stream versions of the PSB channels on that service that should also be made appropriately prominent in disaggregated areas of the UI. So different recommendation rails, for example, and in search and recommendation where that's applicable. And lastly, the other key tenet of the regime is that when the public service broadcasters and the platforms are negotiating commercial deals for carriage, they must act consistently with certain what's termed in the bill statutory objectives. And these objectives aim to ensure that the commercial terms agreed are fair and mutually beneficial, so the agreements reached don't adversely affect the PSB's ability to deliver the public service remit. This is about payment for in terms of terms, but also do not place disproportionate restrictions on platform innovation and consumer choice, which gets us into personalization. And lastly, on our role, Ofcom's role, the bill provides the overall framework, but the devil's in the detail, which we'll have to fill in. In particular, the bill doesn't specify on the face of it where the PSB service and the content needs to be placed on the user interface. This is something we will have to address and set out in a code of conduct, which we'll be developing on how platforms can comply with the prominence requirement. And we'll also publish guidance on how they can act consistently with the statutory objectives when agreeing terms. And very lastly, the overall intent of the regime is very much to incentivize mutually beneficial commercial deals for carriage. Our role is regulatory backstop. In other words, if the deals work well for the public service broadcaster and the platform and are delivering for audiences so they can find and discover public service content easily on that platform, we really do not want to get involved. But as a last resort, the bill does give us dispute resolution functions, so where parties cannot agree terms despite their best endeavours. And we could also enforce the requirements, including sanctions, financial sanctions, up to 5% of worldwide revenues of some of these companies for breaches. I hope that's useful. I didn't want to take too much time on the UK's approach, but give a sense of similarities and differences as we talked about. Hand back to Sally to open up the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. And it's interesting that you mentioned this sort of interaction between must carry and prominence regulations, because the first question that we have actually in Q&A comes from Tombi Makwetu in South Africa, asking about what is actually the interaction between these must carry and prominence regulations, and which one is more important, I guess. And this isn't necessarily just a question for you, but we can go back to the panel.
You're on mute.
And then we also have a question in relation to the interaction between the prominence rules and the country of origin principle in the ACD. So I suggest we go back first to Michèle in relation to must carry. We'll finish with this topic and then go on to. Michèle, can you unmute?
Sorry. Yeah, well, thank you first of all for the discussion and all the points that you've raised. It's very interesting. Now, in terms of must carry and country of origin, I mean, I'm just going to repeat what I said in the report. I mean, there is absolutely no link at the moment on must carry and rules on prominence in none of the member states' legislations at the moment, right? Apart from in the UK. So a little bit like what, I suppose, what, I mean, for me, it would make sense to have the must carry channels. Those would be probably those that should have prominence as well. I mean, you can make links. So the problem is, you know, as Carolina said, you know, of being present on the platform to start with under fair, reasonable and non-discriminatory conditions. Now, how you achieve that? Do you achieve that through must carry? I maybe not, but there is something there. We can feel it in the discussion that, you know, we have to address somehow. And then in terms of the articulation with the rules on a country of origin principle, I think Anna, you know, has acknowledged the issue, and it's not completely clear to me at this stage how we're going to move forward. Apart from, yeah, I mean, for me there are rules in the e-commerce directive that make me believe that the case is not quite similar to the one as we had in relation to Austria, where we have the ruling of the Court of Justice in November, because you have this Article 1.6A6 or something that where there is the idea that the directive is without prejudice to community and national rules on media pluralism. So there is a sort of feeling there that you know you can impose rules on to ensure prominence, which could perhaps not be in line with the e-commerce directive. I don't know, but for me the way forward, and that I'd like to hear Anna, is probably a reform of Article 7A. To include some of the, you know, the points that have been discussed today, and possibly a clarification as to whether, you know, it's possible, because as we've seen, when you see the list of devices in France, we are talking about Alexa, we are talking about the App Store, so we know we have got that. And does it make sense not to have those platforms in scope of prominence rules? That's the key question. So maybe I would like to bounce that off to Anna, but I don't know if that's she'd be happy to answer that.
Yes, thank you, Sally and Michèle, and obviously I'm happy to talk about it because of course it's very high now on our agenda, and that has been, as I said, a little bit the purpose of having introduced the rules on customization in the European Media Freedom Act, in order to inject a bit of European spirit, you know, in this difficult landscape of you know, the very legitimate, you know, laws that pursue this media pluralism objective, but at the same time trying, you know, to give them how should I put it, a bit more of a universal application that can make also the single market work for the different cross-border players. So it is certainly very sensitive, very difficult. Of course, it is our role, you know, and I will start with that, to remind member states, you know, that we are operating, you know, that they, you know, have to fit into the single market. It has been also, I think, it is important for us to remember a little bit the origins of Article 7A in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. It has been introduced at the rather late stage in the negotiations, not necessarily, as you know, probably very well, at the I mean, it has not been in the original Commission proposal, no? So it was obviously, at the time, well, these were early stages, no? I think at the time only one member state, you know, has been considering or introducing the rules on prominence, well, actually considering, not introducing yet, the rules on prominence. And, you know, it was very clear, and that's why it's so, I think you said it's very laconic, no? It's very short. Of course, we have the recitals that still remind member states that when they adopt those rules, they have to fit into the internal market and the union law framework. So I will not deny that these national prominence regimes and the work that we have been doing with media regulators within ERGA has been precisely to do so, is a headache for the European Commission. How do we square the proliferation of these very, I would say, with the legitimate, regimes in terms of the objectives, with the idea that we would like to foster, a common market for media services in Europe that we know very well will always have, certain national specificity, but still we would like this market at least to become a little bit more European. So this will continue to be an issue. You mentioned the case law, and of course we are discussing these issues very closely with the colleagues in the platforms department, that, as you can imagine, are also worried in general, about any national initiative that affects online platforms that now have been also harmonized, with the Commission also being the enforcer of some of the rules vis-a-vis some big players. So we have become a media regulator, so that complicates the matter even more, if you want, for certain players. So this will continue, this will continue to be a discussion. And the only answer I have is that I think the more we can do in terms of guidance, and the more the regulators, can help us in this, and that has been the idea of introducing an active role for the board, in helping us setting out these guidelines, the better outcome we will have in the very end of whatever, however the bagarre, so the ongoing conversation with the member states will end, between the Commission and the member states adopting those rules. And as I said, we are placing, of course, a lot of hopes in a meaningful implementation by the players of the customization rules, because we think that at least partly they might, if you want, already provide an answer without, of course, replacing this additional complementary regime on prominence. And as regards must carry, I think, again, we are here in an area, of course, we have always been discussing, this interaction between the must carry obligations with our colleagues that are dealing with telecommunications and the electronic communications framework. And I think as long as the rules do not converge at national level, we will have to live with this duality of treating these issues at EU level in different frameworks. We are not there yet, as in the UK case, where the two are somehow converging. But I think that the focus, and I think your paper shows this very well, will certainly be much more on this digital environment, on this kind of must offer rule, if you want, that are now a bit the other side of the same coin, of what must carry rules were in the past. So it's to be seen, maybe in the future we will have to somehow rationalize also at EU level and have, I don't know, customization 2.0 rules that will take over, if you want, or try to harmonize national prominence regime more without replacing them entirely, and at the same time somehow bring also elements from the must carry regulation. But this, of course, is not for now.
Very interesting. It seems that there's a bit of a different approach, however. The must carry was, as Jonathan was saying, about kind of ensuring that there's some kind of a business relationship that's mutually beneficial. Where we're talking about ensuring that general interest content gets produced when Alexa gets asked something, essentially a search result, it's a very different kind of mechanism. So there's a lot of things to unpack and see how they go. We do have a question about the timeline. So if we're looking towards the EMFA creating the board and then producing the guidelines, does that mean that the guidelines in relation to Article 7A are pretty far off?
Of course, guidelines under the, I mean, the Commission could produce guidelines, at any point in time. Now, in EMFA, what is the novelty is that when we will be producing the specific guidelines on prominence, we will be assisted by the national media regulators that have, this media pluralism expertise. in terms of timeline, you know, I think we will certainly front load the work on Article 20 on the customization, because this is, of course, something which we've harmonized, you know, at EU level. But of course, as part of this conversation with the stakeholders, you know, we will, because the link is, you know, so obvious and so close that we will not be able to avoid the issues, and probably and hopefully from the stakeholder dialogue that we hope to be launching soon, we will be able also to gather material for the guidelines. So I cannot give you any specific timeline, but it's certainly one of the issues that probably will be relatively high on our agenda in the EMFA implementation.
Okay, super. I hope that answers the question that we had in the chat. We are about at time, but I want to give anyone a chance to make a final comment. We threw out a lot of questions here.
Well, more than a question, I have a provocation, maybe. There's a way in which we could get rid of imposing to providers of user interfaces established in other member states. So there's a way out of that, because I think the EMFA really does provide a possibility to promote, for the member states to promote European standards, and through, for example, HbbTV, there's a way for connected TVs to provide seamless access to prominence services, especially, you know, switching from linear to linear, in a way which will not make European media service providers dependent upon foreign entities.
Okay, interesting.
If I have a chance, Sally, maybe just in 30 seconds. I said we were happy with the provision in France concerning the services, but as you raised and as Michèle raised, there's a huge gap concerning the visibility of programs, of course, and as we know today, the user interfaces present, most of their pages are dedicated to programs and presentation of different programs, films, series, etc., and not services. So that's the big gap. And we also follow with a great attention the what will be the answer of the European Commission concerning the country of origin principle, because depending on that answer, we will have an Article 7A which will be effective or useless. So that's our two main point of attention. Thank you.
Okay, so we finished with two important provocations, so to speak. I would like to give Michèle the last word for any thoughts, and I would like to remind everyone to actually have a look at the report. It's available, and we'll have a link at the end, I think, and it is available on the CERRE website. So apologies if there's anyone whose questions we haven't managed to quite cover. And Michèle, would you have any final comments? Make sure you're not on mute.
Sorry about that. So no, I was just saying it's awfully difficult to conclude. I think I agree with the last statements that were made. So yeah, I mean, if anybody would like to send me their comments, I'm absolutely fascinated by the area, and I think there's so much more to think about. So any comments or points you'd like to raise, I'm always happy to discuss all this with anybody. And it's been brilliant, and I'm really pleased that we've had this conversation, because I think it is absolutely vital that we get a good framework in place on all these questions. So it's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much. It does seem like we will be talking about all of this again in the autumn, after EMFA, after the elections, when we have a new commission in place. And so I would, I guess, say watch this space. I think we will be talking about this again. And we probably have quite a lot more to unpack in terms of the relationships between services and content in disaggregated content. So thank you very much to the participants. Thank you very much for your comments and suggestions. And I guess we look forward to discussing this all again as we move forward on what Anna called the frontier of media policy.